I'm honored to be able to introduce Dr. James Prescott. Thanks to the internet, I discovered his work, his pioneering and courageous work a few years ago on the effects of sensory deprivation and maternal deprivation on mammalian development. In 1966, he created the Developmental Behavioral Biology Program, going against the tide, against the current culture, at the newly established National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. With other scientists and going against, again, contemporary theory, he documented how a failure of mother love results in developmental brain dysfunction and damage, which people did not believe at the time. No one had suspected that abnormal emotional social behaviors that were observed in the isolated monkeys and other animals were due to abnormal brain development and function. But now we know better. Now we know, thanks to him. And he continues now to speak out for children. He speaks out for social pleasure and for nonviolence. And he's a hero of mine, as are the others tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. James Prescott.
Should I close this lid?
Oh, you can,
Yeah, okay. I'm very pleased to be invited to participate in this extraordinary conference. And I'd particularly like to thank Professor Darcia Narvaez for bringing the focus of moral behavior to our symposium, to Jaap Hansek for reminding us that the mammalian brain is at the root of our emotional life, of joy and despair, and the pioneering research on oxytocin, where nasal inhalation of oxytocin holds such promise for infant, child, adult post-traumatic stress disorders. And to Alan Shore for his focus on the neurobiology of attachment and that evolutionary adaptiveness is limited by early life experiences, to be illustrated later in the video clip which will be shown tomorrow evening. This journey of the neurobehavioral sciences of moral behavior is briefly reviewed with the emphasis given to the discoveries of Bill Mason and Mason and Bergson in 1968 and 1975 respectively on the effects of a moving mother surrogate in preventing the wide variety of psychopathologies reported in the primate maternal infant separation studies. In my opinion, these studies are the most important studies in the some 50-year history. Oh. There we go.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. That these are the most important developmental studies in the some 50-year history of primate maternal infant separation studies, including the original pioneering work of the Harlows, which began approximately 1958. The discovery of motion by Mason in 68, Mason and Bergson in 75, opened a new field of sensory brain mechanisms and explaining the psychopathologies of maternal infant separation and the critical role that the vestibular-cerebellar mechanisms have in the regulation of emotional, social, sexual behaviors and for the development of the neurointegrative brain, an essential condition for normal brain behavioral development. which I explored over the years with my associates, who unfortunately are no longer with us. And this will be illustrated later in the film clip from Rockabye Baby, an award-winning time-life documentary film released in 1970. This elimination of emotional behavioral pathologies due to vestibular-cerebellar decortication of a violent adult mother-deprived monkey, which permitted behaviors of petting and hand-feeding not possible before surgery, was conducted by A.J. Berman, Chief of Neurosurgery, the Brooklyn Jewish Medical Center. And again, this will be shown tomorrow evening. It is really a most extraordinary film footage. There's no other film like it in the world. To see this isolation-reared, adult, pathologically violent monkey transformed into peaceful, inquisitive, exploratory, playful behavior is just mind-boggling. And I hope you can be around to see that. Anyway, I'd like to begin this historical review with John Bowlby. Whoops. Let's flip it over. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Oh. Right, okay. John Bowlby in 1951's report to the World Health Organization, titled Maternal Care and the Mental Health, which was published in 1958 by Pelican Books with the title Child Care and the Growth of Love. Bowlby stated, among the most significant developments of psychiatry during the past quarter of a century has been the steady growth of evidence that the quality of the parental care which a child receives in its earliest years is of vital importance for his future mental health. Deprived children, whether in their homes or out of them, are the source of social infection, as real and serious as our carriers of diphtheria and typhoid, and yet just as preventative measures have reduced these diseases to negligible proportions, so can determined active actions greatly reduce the number of deprived children in our midst and the growth of adults liable to produce more of them. Yet so far, no country has tackled this problem seriously. Even in so-called advanced countries, there's a tolerance for conditions of bad mental hygiene in nurseries, institutions, and hospitals to a degree which, if it were found in the field of physical hygiene, would long since have led to public outcry. The second factor still at work is a lack of conviction on the part of governments, social agencies, and the public that mother love in infancy and childhood is as important for mental health as are vitamins and proteins for physical health. One must be aware of a vested interest in the institutional care of children. Bowlby's counsel is as relevant today as it was in 1951. In 1968, the year of publication of Perspectives on Human Deprivation, Biological, Psychological, and Sociological by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which stated in the preface the following. It was in response both to its mandate and to the compelling nature of the problem of our times that the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development undertake a broad-based assessment of psychosocial deprivation in order to ascertain the state of the art, to identify gaps in knowledge and understanding, and to determine the implications of the findings for research policy and for social action programs. As a result of their reviews, the authors of the 4 chapters are unanimous in urging that high priority and massive support be given to expansion of research in psychosocial deprivation. They stress the necessity for achieving more through understanding of the intricate relationships of biomedical and social problems in order that national social action programs can be effective and relevant to the populations concerned. From the preface, Gerald Levesque, MD Director. In Chapter 4 of that volume, titled Biological Substrates of Development and Behavior, Donald Lindsley and Austin Reeson, chairman, stated, "The possibility of identifying specific neural structures and the specification of a biological predisposition to violent, aggressive behavior and impaired socialization as a consequence of lack of early sensory social experience remains to be validated by future research and suggests another exciting frontier in the behavioral biological sciences, which has long-range and substantive implications for human development and society." This massive support to be given to expansion of research and psychosocial deprivation was never realized. Although some progress has been made since 1968, the principal findings of the research that has been conducted has been either ignored or forgotten or failed to be translated into effective public health programs, as our current infant-child mortality rates and the magnitude of violence and self-destructive behaviors indicate. In 1970, the year of the 1970 White House Conference on Children, where Professor Yuri Bronfenbrenner, scientific chairman of the conference, and in his capacity as chairman Forum 15 on Children and Parents, stated, "America's families and their children are in trouble so deep and pervasive as to threaten the future of our nation. The source of the trouble is nothing less than a national neglect of children and those primarily engaged in the care, Americans' parents." The editorial committee objected to the statement on the grounds that applied only to a minority of the nation's children and that therefore no note of urgency was justified. I strongly disagree. Page 252. Not much has changed from 1970 to 2010 except a continuing deterioration of America's children and families, an indictment of failed health policy in America. In 1970, the Time Life film Rockabye Baby was premiered and is available, in this DVD, which is going to be available at the bookstore. In 1971, the first published NICHD study that documented septo and subcortical spiking in adult mother-deprived monkeys by Salzberg, Lustig, and Heath, with the potential for identifying the pathological violent offender by Salzberg in 1977, the NICHD did not support a collaborative research project proposal with the Federal Bureau of Prisons to evaluate the Salzberg proposal of 1977. Subcortical spiking is a signature of violent behavior and disorders. In 1972, the year that I published Before Ethics and Morality in the Humanist, where I asked the question, what is ethical and moral behavior? What is moral education? Without a definition of the former, a curriculum for the latter cannot be developed. The diversity of ethical and moral behavior reflects the diversity of human societies. What is ethical and moral behavior for one may be unethical and immoral for another. On the basis of cross-cultural studies of human behavior, can we establish some uniform and invariant principles of moral behavior that would apply to all human societies? Probably not. Even the taking of human life has its cultural and moral acceptance in societies known for the religious rites of human sacrifice and infanticide. As ethical humanists, we can, however, define our principles of ethical and moral behavior and then proceed to develop a curriculum to achieve the fulfillment of these principles. In this context, one fundamental principle of moral behavior from the ethical humanist perspective can be identified: the rejection of creeds, policies, and specific behaviors that inflict pain, suffering, and deprivation upon our fellow man. The converse of this principle is not just the absence of pain, suffering, and deprivation, but rather the enhancement of pleasure, the promotion of affectional human relationships, the pursuit of excellence in individual development, and in general, the enrichment of human violence. Therefore, we have this polarity of the avoidance of pain and enhancement of pleasure. These are the two basic fundamental principles of human life. The issue of human violence and human pleasure are pivotal to any theory, scientific or religious, of moral behavior. Violence and pleasure are reciprocally related. That is, the presence of one inhibits the other. And certain critical early sensory experiences during the formative periods of development provide for the neurointegrative substrate and propensities to either violence-seeking or pleasure-seeking behaviors. These beginnings are traced to maternal social deprivation and to parental child indifference and the abuse that results in specific forms of sensory deprivation. Pain and pleasure forms a scientific bridge to moral philosophy and theology and permits the validation of these moral principles based upon speculative philosophy and theology. Oh, that was it. Sorry. I think I've got myself. Yeah, okay. Yes. 1974. The publication of the article, The Effect of Cerebellar Lesions on Emotional Behavior in the Rhesus Monkeys by Berman, and Prescott in the Cerebellum, Epilepsy, and Behavior, which documented that paleocerebellar, but not neocerebellar decortication could eliminate all the pathological violence in an adult mother-deprived monkey and replace it with inquisitive exploratory behaviors that could accept touching, petting, and hand-feeding, behaviors not possible before surgery. A film clip of behavioral change induced by paleocerebellar, but not neocerebellar decortication will be shown tomorrow. Cannon's law of denervation supersensitivity, published in 1939, is the neurophysiological mechanism mediating the behavioral emotional disorders of sensory deprivation and maternal-infant separation. 1974. The NICHD Conference on Child Abuse and Neglect, Issues in Developmental Research. Opening remarks by Gilbert Woodside, who's the acting director of NICHD at the time. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to make the opening remarks at this conference on research in the important area of child abuse and child neglect. The convening of this conference is one of the tasks assumed by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development in connection with a request about a year ago by Secretary Weinberger for increased emphasis on child abuse and neglect by the agencies of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. The conference proceedings were never published, and the funds allocated for its publication was transferred to the NIH by Dr. Norman Kretschmer, who was director of NISD, to support another project. (1975), the year of publication of my essay on body pleasure and the origins of violence, and what monkeys can tell us about human violence by Gary Mitchell, in the Futurist, the April edition, that described the fateful consequences of mother-infant separation upon brain behavioral development. This writer's cross-cultural studies of 49 tribal cultures documented that peaceful or violent nature of 73% of cultures studied could be predicted from the single measure of baby carrying through the first year of life. Corrected errors in texture which is a resource of my cross-cultural studies published in 1967, raised the prediction to 80%. The measure of violence was killing, torture, and mutilation of the enemy captured in warfare, the most extreme measure of violence in texture. The article Body Pleasure and Origins of Violence was reprinted in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists with the summary: a neuropsychologist contends that the greatest threat to world peace comes from those nations which have the most depriving environments to their children and are most repressive of sexual affection and female sexuality. (1975), the publication of the NICHD Conference on Brain Function and Malnutrition, Neuropsychological Methods of Assessment, which contained an article by Dr. Heath, Maternal Social Deprivation and Abnormal Brain Development, Disorders of Emotional and Social Behavior, that reviewed the history of his brain behavior research on pathologically violent adult rhesus monkeys who were reared mother-deprived under an NICHD contract with Bernd Salzberg, the principal investigator. (1980), or 1979, child abuse and violence. Statistical graphs. The high correlations between infant-child mortality and homicide, but not suicide, for 50 states for the years 1940 through 1968, and the statistically significant correlations that predict future homicide rates from prior infant mortality rates of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. This is the graph that shows the high significant correlations between infant mortality and homicide. Again, this is a national profile for the 50 states and DC. This is the same graph for child mortality. Every correlation for homicide is significant. The correlations with for suicide are not. This is the graph that shows the predictive value of infant mortality rate measured at the years 1930, 1940, 50, and 60. And every one of these correlations are statistically significant. What we see here is the growth of the magnitude of correlations from those that are predicted from the 30s and 40s as to those that are predicted from the 50s and 60s. The reason for this is that infant mortality had a major contribution of uncontrolled infectious diseases in the 30s and 40s. This is brought under control by the 50s and 60s, and therefore permitted the psychosocial deprivation factors to emerge in this analysis. Okay, yes, okay. (1980), the wrongful termination of Dr. Prescott by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which terminated a 17-year career in federal science administration. Reasons for dismissal: removal for improper use of official position and resources to promote research on developmental origins of violence and child abuse and neglect, subjects that are not within the mission of the NICHD as part of the programs of this institute. And this is in the light of all the previous data that I've quickly reviewed for you. (1992), publication by Jared Diamond, the third chimpanzee, documented a 99% commonality of DNA between Homo sapiens and the bonobo chimpanzee, hardly a brief for the genetic basis of violent or peaceful behaviors. Recall that the bonobo is the most peaceful, nonviolent primate on this planet, and Homo sapiens is the most violent, destructive primate on this planet. (1994), the year of the publication of the NIH research on antisocial, aggressive, and violence-related behaviors and their consequences. A. NIH panel findings and recommendations. Violence constitutes the second leading cause of death for youth in America, and it poses a health risk for persons of all ages. And in a footnote to the report, a small minority of the panel feel that a comprehensive research approach to violence should entail a more equal balance between the biomedical and psychosocial aspects of violence-related behaviors and their consequences. B. The NIH research portfolio, with the exception of the National Institute of Mental Health, violence research has not been a major priority at NIH, page 75. C. In fiscal 1992, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development spent about $8.9 million on research related to violence. This estimate does not agree with the $4.1 million, that is 0.8%, reported on Table 1, page 12. Appendix F. Devoting as much money to peace studies as to the studies of violence, page 121. This is the only reference to Dr. Prescott's extensive testimony. No mention of the history of NICHD research on child abuse, neglect, and developmental origins of violence. E. Summary, September 22 to 24th, 1993 meeting. To date, investment across all institutes and ICDs in violence-related research has been minuscule relative to the total NIH budget. That is 0.5 of 1%. The limited funds to continue to handicap research, training, and programming planning in this area. The NIHD in fiscal 92 supported 22 research grants for a sum of $4 million, or 0.8% of the total NICHD budget. The NIMH for fiscal 92 supported 132 research projects for a sum of $38.2 million, or 6.8% of the total NIMH budget. Less than 0.5%, about $2 million, of the NIMH funds were devoted to biological research on violence. I expect this percentage of the NIH budget has deteriorated from the 0.5 of 1% of 1992, and the growth of violence, self-destructive behaviors, child abuse and neglect, and domestic violence continues without priority and without reference to the crucial developmental years noted by John Bowlby, Yuri Bronfenberg, and many other authorities. The NIH Conference on Violence of 1994 and 2004 failed to recognize the pioneering study of Rain, Brennan, and Mednick that birth complications combined with early maternal rejection at age 1 predisposes to violent crime at age 18 years. The NIH Conference on Violence of 2004, Preventing Violence and Related Health-Risking Social Behaviors in Adolescence, an NIH State of the Science Conference, October 13 to 15, remains unpublished. None of the recommendations of these conferences have been implemented. New information is needed on the current percent expenditures in violence research, and specifically on the developmental and biological foundations of violent behavior as a consequence of impaired or affectional bonding in the maternal-infant-child relationship, and the peaceful, harmonious, and egalitarian behaviors resulting from high maternal-infant-child affectional bonding. MRI, and fMRI brain studies are desperately needed. 1997, Franz de Waal and Franz Landing published Bonobo, The Forgotten Ape, and stated, enter the bonobo, which is best characterized as a female-centered, egalitarian primate species that substitutes sex for aggression. Physical violence almost never occurs in bonobos, yet is common in chimpanzees. And they nurse for 4 years and are carried around even longer. Their mother takes them everywhere she goes. And the picture emerging for Wamba then is one of a female-centered society in which even the male rank order is largely determined by mothers. As noted before, Homo sapiens shares 90% of our DNA with the bonobo. So much for genes in explaining peaceful or violent behavior. Whether mothers are important or not, we have much to learn from the bonobo. (1999), Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy in Mother Nature, A History of Mothers, Infants, and Natural Selection, stated, great ape mothers carry their infants wherever they go. Fathers, by comparison, are rarely in direct contact with babies. And it was the mother who continuously carried the infant in skin-to-skin contact, stomach to stomach, chest to breast, soothed by her heartbeat, nestled in the heat of her body, rocked by her movements. The infant's entire world was its mother. No wild monkey or ape mother has ever been observed to deliberately harm her own baby. What has happened along the evolutionary trail where human maternal violence against her offspring has suddenly emerged without any history of such behavior in the primate evolutionary record? How this great unanswered question is answered will determine the future of humanity. (1999), the Dalai Lama in Ethics for the New Millennium stated, in calling for a spiritual revolution, am I advocating a religious solution to our problems after all? No. Page 19. And despite the body of opinion suggesting that human nature is basically aggressive and competitive, my own view is that our appreciation for affection and a love is so profound that it begins even before birth. A happy mother bears a happy child. Almost without exception, the mother's first act is to offer her baby her nourishing milk, an act which to me symbolizes unconditional love. What we see instead is a relationship based on love and mutual tenderness, which is totally spontaneous. It is not learned from others. No religion requires it. No laws impose it. No schools have taught it. It arises quite naturally. Pages 66, 67. The impoverishment of breastfeeding in this nation and the nations of the world reflects on why we are violent. But weaning age is never asked of those who are violent or peaceful. Weaning age must be included in the immunological record of every infant and child and published like the infant and child mortality statistics. The weaning age of 30 months or greater in tribal cultures. Table 1 presents the high and low suicide cultures with weaning age of 2.5 years or greater compared to breastfeeding for less than 24 months. This is derived from Texter, a cross-cultural summary. It was found that 77%, 20 out of 26 cultures, where weaning age is 2.5 years or greater, are low or absent in suicide. 82%, 14 out of 17 cultures with a weaning age of 2.5 years and greater, and support youth sexual expression, have low suicides or absent in suicide. The high suicide cultures with weaning age of 2.5 years or greater all inflicted pain upon the infant. So we must always go back to this dichotomy. It's the pain and pleasure. The breastfeeding group with 24 months or less in Texter compared to 30 months is a poor measure of impoverished breastfeeding and a zero breastfeeding group would yield different results, but does not exist in tribal cultures. Only 10% of tribal cultures have weaning age of 12 months or less, compared to 93.2% of American mothers. Barry and Paxson. Table 2 presents the weaning age of tribal cultures for 30 months or greater versus less than 24 months of age. This represents pooled data from Textor and Berry and Paxson published codes of 1971, where I calculated the average weaning age of cultures in Berry and Paxson. It's 186 culture sample from the range scores given for weaning age of these cultures. These data were then related to the suicide of these cultures. The results, 86%, 31 out of 36 of low suicide cultures have weaning age of 30 months or greater. 66% of high suicide cultures have weaning age 30 months or greater. It should be noted that Texas Code 473 on suicide is not a pure measure of suicide, but is mixed with homicidal behaviors. Breastfeeding is a necessary but insufficient condition for the prevention of suicide. Studies in modern human cultures that confirm brain differences and high breastfeeding conditions versus no breastfeeding are desperately needed. In 2004, the CDC, breastfeeding practices, results from the National Immunization Survey. Each year, the CDC National Immunization Program, in partnership with CDC's National Center for Health Statistics, conducted the National Immunization Survey within all 50 states, District of Columbia, and selected geographical areas within the states. Since July 2001, breastfeeding questions have been asked on the NIS to assess the population's breastfeeding practices. Children are 19 to 35 months old at the time of the interview. Map 3 for the year 2004 presents the percent children breastfed at 12 months by state and the infant mortality rate for 2004, which I superimposed on this map. Principal findings are 90%, 9 out of 10 states, with less than 15% of children breastfeeding at 12 months have the highest infant mortality rates. 83%, 10 out of 12 states, with greater than 25% of children breastfeeding at 12 months have the lowest infant mortality rates. Remember, this is the national profile. The number of subjects in each of the 4 breastfeeding groups is given, and it should be noted that only 2,611 subjects are represented in those states that have children breastfeeding at 12 months of age, compared to 25,814 individuals in the remaining states, for a total of 28,425 subject sample, only 9% of the sample. This was not originally published by the CDC, or the National Center for Vital Statistics, and I requested this information from the CDC so I could make this analysis. What is remarkable about this study on percent children breastfed at 12 months by state are the significant linkages to infant mortality, with only 9% of the sample breastfeeding for greater than 12 months. Clearly, breastfeeding bonding is a necessary but insufficient condition for the prevention of infant mortality. Year 2010. The American Academy of Policy Statement on Child Fatality Review, published just recently in Pediatrics, states, the preventable death of a child is an unparalleled tragedy for a family. Similarly, a nation's ability to reduce child mortality rates is a measure of that society's overall well-being. And failure to address preventable causes of child mortality is a national tragedy. Each year in the United States, more than 17,000 infants and children die from injury, which remains the leading cause of child mortality in the United States. Add to this the number of preventable non-injury deaths, including many deaths related to prematurity, and it becomes clear that the majority of American child deaths are preventable. The really shocking information in this policy statement of the AAP is that no acknowledgement is made of the significant homicidal components in infant mortality rate, nor breastfeeding isn't even mentioned. Yet breastfeeding is the most critical, crucial developmental event that can prevent and reduce infant mortality. Not even mentioned. Genital mutilation of children is torture. Here we're talking about early life experiences, how it affects developing brain and behavior. Signatures were collected at the 11th International Symposium, Circumcision, Genital Integrity, and Human Rights, this past July, at the University of California, Berkeley. Petitions Senator Leahy to hold hearings on why the Obama administration refuses to enforce constitutional and international law to protect our children from torture and to take action that enforces the equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment. Federal law makes it a crime to mutilate the genitals of females with no comparable protection for male children, which is unconscionable and an act of sexual discrimination. This author believes that genital mutilation forms the first foundation for sadomasochistic behavior, pain followed by pleasure. And to experience sexual pleasure, you must first experience pain. No wonder that modern human cultures have become sadomasochistic cultures. Supporting letters to Senator Leahy is requested, and hopefully this conference might address that issue. 2010. Judith Palfrey, who's president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, issued a corrective statement on May 14, 2010, to the policy statement on female genital cutting, FGC. Note the use of the term cutting, a euphemism for mutilation. She states, the AAP does not endorse the practice of offering a clitoral nick. This minimal pinprick is forbidden under federal law, and the AAP does not recommend it to its members. The AAP is steadfast in its goal of protecting all young girls from the harms of FGC. This was based upon the AAP's Committee on Bioethics that recommended and endorsed the clitoral nick. And there's a huge storm of protests of letters that flooded the AAP, and that can be found on Pediatrics Online. Here's a summary of my organization of the complexity of social cultures, reflected in how pain and pleasure is encoded in our two cultural brains, our subcortical, social, emotional, sexual brain, and our neocortical, thinking, rational, cognitive brain. And there's a handout that has this graph, and you can study it at your leisure. But clearly, pain and pleasure are the primary motivating experiences for our moral behaviors. How we value pain and pleasure in human relationships determines who we are, what we become, and what our culture becomes. I would like to conclude with some quotations that I think may be helpful for us. First is, therefore the highest good is some sort of pleasure, despite the fact that most pleasures are bad, and if you would like, bad in the unqualified sense of the word. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, Book 7. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. George Santayana, The Life of Reason, 1905. Not those who die, but those who die before they must and want to die. Those who die in agony and pain are the great indictments against civilization. Herbert Marcuse, Eros and Civilization, 1962. And finally, women are the mothers of humanity. Do not let us ever forget that or underemphasize its importance. What mothers are to their children, so will man be to man. Ashley Montague, The Natural Superiority of Women. Thank you.
We have time for a question or two. Comment? Go ahead.
Just a point of fact. In fact, in most wild living primates, somewhere between 5-10% of the mothers will neglect or abuse their offspring, particularly their first offspring. So, Sarah Weber Hardy's statement is not factually correct.
This is not true, I believe, for the bonobo.
That's correct.
I mean,
nobody reported, but for other ape species and certainly old world primates, it's around 5 to 10%.
okay, then that's a correction for the record, but my basic point is that for the bonobo chimpanzee, that's not true. Okay.
Thank you for that. It was extremely interesting as a review of a field I haven't followed up to this point. Over that time, I've been working with infant feeding issues. And I really appreciated your understanding of the importance of breastfeeding. But it isn't simply that breastfeeding has such profound neurobiological effects on the mother and on the child. The thing that is completely under-researched is one of the things that correlates with all of the time frames where you've seen violence arise, and that is the actual changes in the composition of the substitutes that are given to babies, which lack things like insulin, like growth factor and so forth, which also provide vast quantities of proteins that children can't metabolize in quantities that have been, by the protein biochemists, found to be at levels sufficient to cause brain insult. And we have changed proteins and quantities of and all the rest of it without any of the adequate research along the way. And I'm hoping that from this conference there'll be more awareness, indeed, not just of the positives of breastfeeding and its necessity as an immunobiological moderator for the just-born child to adapt to its environment, but also of the positive risks of substitutes in themselves to the child that is growing, which has been completely neglected because the only people who look at research into infant formula are in fact the manufacturers.
Yes. Let me state my personal conviction on this point of breastfeeding. I think that the invention of formula milk and the plastic bottle and plastic nipple is the worst disastrous invention of the 20th century. It has so interfered with the natural affectional bonding between mother and infant. It's not just the milk.